Well, good morning. Thanks for coming. And in a lot of my conversation lately, it seems that people have been talking to me about change. And so I thought it would be a good day to talk about that and how we should be ready for change. We have to stay open for it and expect that's going to happen, because the reality is the future is going to change whether we like it or not. Mark Twain once wrote that the only person who likes change is a wet baby. And it's like, well, yeah, there's truth to that. Despite that feeling about change, it's inevitable, right? The reason we don't like it, though, is because we get comfortable where we are. We get comfortable with our friends. We get comfortable with our job. We get comfortable with our surroundings. And even if we don't like some of them very much, sometimes we put up with them because they're familiar. But what happens is we get kind of stuck in the past. And God's too good to us to let us just do that. He wants us to move forward. And He says, just because I've blessed you where you are doesn't mean that you're supposed to be there forever. In the business world, we see stories like this all the time. There's the famous story of Netflix and Blockbuster. Blockbuster had the big business going, doing very well. Netflix guys come along and say, hey, would you like to buy our technology? They say, no thanks, we're doing just fine the way we are. Right now, which one is out of business and which one is ruling the roost? Well, that's Netflix, because they saw the change. They saw it coming. So sometimes we have to take this lesson as, well, just because something worked 5 years ago, 10 years, 20, whatever it is, just because it worked before doesn't mean it's going to work next time. And it's the same thing that's happening in our lives. If we're going to be happy, we ultimately have to be willing to see change. We have to be willing to do that, because every blessing that we receive isn't meant to be permanent. Every provision we're given isn't necessarily forever. We see this with the children of Israel, right? They go out to the desert. The Lord gives them manna to eat every day. That was really convenient, to wake up in the morning and have your breakfast on the ground ready for you. Super easy, barely an inconvenience, right? It was so good. But it sustained them for 40 years. For 40 years. People just accepted that as part of life. But eventually they had to realize that phase of life was over. They crossed over the Jordan. No more manna. They were smart enough to realize they had to keep moving forward. And even though you got to consider, for the people who crossed the Jordan, this is all they had seen their entire life, right? This is everything they'd always seen. But things change. Things change. They had to see that this was a temporary situation, getting manna, and even though it was a long time, sometimes these things come to an end. Now, they were going into a land flowing with milk and honey, so I mean there is an upgrade, but it's still a change. And we don't really like change because, well, it's different. The Lord probably could have given them manna forever if He wanted to, but there's happiness and joy in the change. This is why we experience the changing of the seasons and the changing of the weather, because it makes things better by not having the sameness all the time. We need these differences in our lives. We've got to have new adventures, new experiences. And so we have to do our part and stay open to these things. I mean, the reality is it's going to happen anyways. Things are going to happen. It just is. So when the old blessings aren't happening anymore, we have to make sure we don't get stuck in that place. You know, you don't want to take the defibrillators of life and just shock old blessings back into existence. You know, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. Where it says, no. I'm giving you something new. I'm giving you this land flowing with milk and honey. All right? The old sometimes has to go away, but be ready, because I'm going to give you something new to replace it. And sometimes the change isn't that big. Sometimes it's just a little tweak to something that's been happening for a while. But that tweak is all the difference. There's a story that some of you might be familiar with. It's children of Israel again. They're in the desert. They need water. Moses strikes the rock. Water comes out. Perfect. Well, the same story happens again in the book of Numbers. Still in the desert, still thirsty, need water. And it varies on how the translations go as to how this works out. But one translation of this says that Moses went to the rock, struck it twice, gets water. But the contention is what went wrong here. Some people say the translation should be, well, the Lord told Moses to speak to the rock. Oh, just because you struck the rock the last time this happened, you got water, doesn't mean you're supposed to strike the rock again. You were supposed to listen to the instructions of speaking to the rock to make the water come out. Of course, the price was high for Moses because he wasn't allowed to enter the promised land because of this. But it's and that's the importance of the tweak, right? Oh, no, this time I'm going to speak to it. I'm not going to strike it. There are plenty of examples in life where this kind of happens, where small things can make a big difference. I came across this story about a restaurant owner in Washington, D.C. Opened a brand new place, great fanfare, great reviews, great service, everything was top notch. But he noticed about 6 months in that the business was dwindling. What used to be a packed house wasn't so packed anymore. And he's wondering, well, what did I do? What did I miss here? He was talking to one of the customers, explaining, I don't understand what's going on. And the customer says, oh, I can tell you what's going on. No problem. He says, well, I don't know if you've realized this, but where you're located, you are right near CIA headquarters, Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. And guess what? A lot of your customers work for the CIA. The problem is your tables are so close to each other, when a CIA person comes in here, they do not get a private conversation. So they got to go somewhere else to have the private conversations. So this guy, to his credit, listens to the patron, to the customer, and he rips out about 12 tables. Opens things up, has more corners, more privacy, and guess what you know? Small change, big difference. Small change, big difference. But we have to be willing to make those kind of adjustments, whether it be in our attitude, in our relationships, in your jobs, in your hobbies. You know, we don't want to be the Blockbuster. We want to be the Netflix, right? Because we got to see there's always a better way to do things. So we have to ask ourselves, are we still striking the rock when we're supposed to be speaking to it? Are we trying to still get manna when we've crossed into the Holy Land? Right? We see this all the time with technology. You know, you don't see people using typewriters anymore. It's not an offense about typewriters or typewriter makers, but I tell you what, it's a heck of a lot more convenient and efficient to use a computer to create a document. We're not supposed to use temporary things and make them permanent. If you do that, well, it doesn't really work out well for you. Now, I do think the Lord, you know, He loves us too much, and He'll push us when we need it. Sometimes He's just going to take those provisions and they're going to dry up, right? The manna just stopped. It wasn't like they had a choice in the matter and the Lord said, hey, you guys should really stop doing that. No, He just takes it away. And sometimes that happens for us as well. The Lord opens doors, but sometimes He closes them too. You know, an opportunity goes away, a client leaves the customer, or somebody, a good friend, moves to their city. You know, what happened? Nothing really happened. The manna just stopped coming. And God isn't trying to make our lives miserable, of course. He's just trying to get us to move a little bit farther. He's trying to take us to a higher level. He's trying to say that I know you've received a good blessing out of this, but I've got something more for you too. Because He's going to take that person out of your life so that you can go do something else. Whether they've gotten sick, whether they've moved on, whether they've passed on. Maybe that person isn't helping you, that you're just so comfortable with them that you just stay where you are instead of moving a little bit higher. That person served their purpose. And so when we come into our promised land, and we really shouldn't be surprised that some of the people that we might have thought were there aren't going to be there. It's not because they're bad people or, did bad things. It's just that they're not part of our progression of life. And it's hard because sometimes you form bonds with somebody who has helped you out in a tough situation. And you form it gets tight with them. And I saw this one person make an analogy about it. He says, people like that who come and rescue us in times of life are like scaffolding on a building. When a building is old and tired, you put scaffolding around it to repair it, to have access to the higher difficult places. And some people like that, some people in our lives are like that scaffolding. They're there to be with us when we need them, someone to talk to, a shoulder to lean on, someone to help us feel good about ourselves again. But when the work is done, the scaffolding comes down. When that person has done their job, they move on and they help out somebody else. It's your job to move on as well and help somebody else and not get stuck in trying to keep that relationship up forever. You don't leave the scaffolding up indefinitely. So there's a season for mourning over things, and there's a season for moving on, and we see this in the prophets, right? Elijah gets in big trouble with the king of Israel. God says to Elijah, time to move on, time to get out of town, the king is coming after you. He says, I want you to go to this brook, and I'll take care of you there. And that's what we're going to read in our story today. It's from 1 Kings chapter 17. It says, now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Some time later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. Now, if you're in Elijah's shoes, you've got a pretty good setup. He's controlling the rain. There's no rain or dew until he says so. So he could have said, this ravine, not so bad. I think I'll just stay here a little bit longer, let those ravens keep bringing in the food. I'll call on for some rain so my brook won't dry up, and I'll just be good here. Everything's working just fine the way it is. But that's not what the Lord told him to do, is it? He says, I'm telling you to send the rain. And I'm telling you, go somewhere else. Your brook is drying up, but I'm still going to take care of you. I'm just going to take care of you somewhere else. And you're going to have provisions over there. And he did say, you're going to go to Zarephath, and this woman will have food for you. And sometimes the Lord tells us the same thing. You might be happy with what you're doing right now. You've got a good job. You've got a good friendship group. You've got a good, whatever going on, volunteering, whatever it is, looking after the grandkids. And he says, I need you to step out of your comfort zone on this. Trust me. And just like he says to us, he says, I know you like those things, but that was a season in life. We've all had those different things where we've done for a while and have moved on from. And so the same thing with Elijah. Sometimes we don't want to listen to the calling of the Lord, but we have to. Because Elijah's purpose wasn't just to be in that ravine and be fed. He goes to this Zarephath and he meets the widow, and he's really doing something better, isn't he? Because the widow thinks she's about to die, but because Elijah comes into her life, he does this miracle where she has this pot of flour that never ends. She's down to her last bit of food. So his being sent somewhere else helps somebody else out. Later in the story, her son gets sick, nearly dies. He saves him too. So Elijah's changing of direction dramatically changes a couple lives very clearly. And so what seems like probably a struggle for him to get out of his comfort zone ends up being really good for somebody else. Now, it's really easy to get stuck in a comfort zone. This is what we do, right? We have these patterns that we like and these routines that we build, and we build them because we like them. Oh yeah, I like doing this. And then we have to find out somewhere along the line that, oh, well, you know what? That hobby, that job, that whatever was a stepping stone. That was just a piece of the process. Because you're not done, right? We all have life left to live. There's another process ahead for you. So I read this Elijah story and I think, well, maybe we need to be careful that we're not trying to get water from a brook that's dried up. I think that's the lesson there. We don't want that to be us. We have to find some new opportunities. We have to find some new things to do. We have to make adjustments in our life. And perhaps part of the reason we don't do that, though, is that we think that change equals failure. Oh, well, if I do this and I give up that, that must mean I failed at what I was starting on. And I don't think that's how we're supposed to read these stories. It's easy. I feel like hells want to tell us that. Oh, you're not good enough. You didn't try hard enough. Come on, you got to keep doing. But I don't see Elijah having failed in this story. I don't see the children of Israel having failed when they had to give up the manna. There's no failure there. It's just a progression. Sometimes we just have to accept that part of God's plan is change. And it's not an indictment as to whether we ate properly enough and that's why this thing happened, or it's not an indictment that we didn't do this, that, or the other. Some things just are part of the season. They're just temporary. They're not meant to last forever. And it's hard to find the balance between perseverance and pushing forward on something and knowing when to give up and move on. So the funny thing I think about all this is, as I'm thinking about change, we see this so clearly with children. We bring a child into the world, and all right, they start off nursing, and then they move to maybe a bottle or some solid foods. The kids don't necessarily like this. They don't want to give up one thing that they're comfortable with for these solid foods. No thanks. I'll just take the food on demand from mom. That's great. But all throughout their lives, we're pushing them a little bit farther. Okay, now you're going to tie your shoes. Now you're going to dress yourself. Teaching a kid to swim. Okay, swim to me here. Now you step a little further back. Now swim to me here. You're always pushing. We know this is part of life for children, and they need that. Nothing's changed. We need that too. We need that too. God gives us temporary provisions to help us on the way, to push us out of our comfort zone, but He does it so that we can also have a greater blessing ahead. We don't always fully develop unless some things are taken away. In John chapter 15, you get this familiar line, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, He prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Gardeners know this, right? You've got to chop things back to make it more useful. When the branch falls off, you don't try to reattach it. You go, okay, that branch served its purpose, on to the next. So yeah, the brook may dry up, the manna may stop, but there's also going to be something else that comes in place. The story isn't over. Secrets of Heaven writes it this way. It says, life without changes and variations would lead to sameness, and so no life at all. No life without change. Jeremiah the prophet says, thus says Jehovah, who gives the sun light by day and the ordinance of the moon and the stars for light by night. These ordinances will not depart from me. And when you read that and combine it with Secrets of Heaven, I think what you're seeing is he's writing that change isn't a suggestion. It's not a recommendation. It's mandatory. Change is going to happen whether you like it or not. And we think, I don't want to change. Well, This is your reminder that things do change, and it's just going to happen. We don't want it. Sometimes we don't welcome it. Sometimes we kick back hard against it. But we have to be open to it. We don't necessarily have to embrace it at the beginning, but at the same time, I think the more we stay open to it, the easier the changes are. That's what we're trying to do here today. Are we asking ourselves, am I open to change when these things come my way? Am I willing to at least consider it? Am I willing to have the attitude of believing that the blessing I had today may not be the blessing I have tomorrow? Can we see that some things are temporary and some things are not? Because there's change coming, and it's up to us to be willing and ready for it when it comes our way. Amen.